So welcome everybody to the meeting of the Royal Society of South Africa. And this talk is also co-hosted by the Academy of Science of South Africa. And the talk is going to be by Professor Mike Bruton, FRSSAf, and it is the importance of Charles Darwin's visit to the Cape of Good Hope. I'm not going to read too much about the speaker because it's going to take up too much time, but he's a long-standing fellow of the Royal Society and a recipient of the prestigious Marlow Medal. Okay, and he's so I'm not going to read it all out, but he's been director of the are you still the director, Mike?
No.
No, that's what I thought. You'd retired. You were the director of the JLB Smith Institute of Ichthyology, now renamed the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity. And basically, he's been looking at life history strategies of fishes and other vertebrates. And that's what he's done. Yeah, that's what he's been doing. He's done a whole load of things, and he served as the head of education at the new Two Oceans Aquarium in Cape Town, and then launched the MTN Science Centre, now the Cape Town Science Centre. And he's lived and worked in South Africa, well, and Dubai and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, developing science centers and museums. He now consults to a company that develops multimedia experiences for informal education institutions. So we have a really good speaker, and I'd like to apologize on behalf of the society. This was supposed to be a talk in May, and there was a glitch, and we just couldn't get Mike on board. He was there frantically emailing and telephoning, and it was highly stressful. So I'd like to apologize for that. Normally I would have and I've got them, is an introductory set of slides, and I was too frightened to put them up because I didn't want anything else to go wrong. So we will have questions afterwards, and for those of you who missed it, we are recording this, and the recording will be available on our website. So thank you very much, Professor Mike Bruton, and please take it away.
Right, thank you so much, Leslie, and it's a great pleasure to be back in the fold of the Royal Society. Charles Darwin is someone who has interested me ever since I was a student, as it should all biologists and geoscientists. And I believe he has a remarkable life that we can still identify with now. He was born in 1809, died in 1882 at the age of 73, and he lived in an era which was a great time to make scientific discoveries. It was the end of the first and the beginning of the second industrial revolution. There were great discoveries, voyages of discovery, inventions, the abolition of slavery. The Lunar Society ignited all sorts of industrial actions. It was really a great time to reveal truths about science to the general public. The Church of England's hold on people's minds was being questioned by the scientific establishment, and people were open to new ideas. This is what Dickens wrote about it. It was the best of times, the worst of times, the age of wisdom, the age of foolishness, the epoch of belief, the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. Charles, pictured here with his sister Catherine, was born in Shrewsbury in Shropshire. His mother died when he was 8, so to a large extent his sister brought him up together with his father, and he was educated in Shrewsbury School, but he wasn't a very enthusiastic learner. He commented at the time, school as a means of education to me was simply a blank. And we need to remember that the education curriculum at that time was purely a classical curriculum with no science. It wasn't until 1840 that science was introduced into the English curriculum. So he was a bored student who spent most of his time out in the countryside collecting fossils and minerals and insects and stuff, and ignoring his studies. At the age of 16, Charles's rather authoritarian father, Robert, grew frustrated with his son's lack of achievement and sent him to Edinburgh University to follow the family tradition of studying medicine and becoming a medical doctor. Unfortunately, this experiment also failed because Darwin was he had a very mild and sensitive nature, and he was absolutely appalled by amputations without anesthetics and the very boring curriculum. But one thing he did do was learn the art of taxonomy from John Edmonston, who was a freed slave from Guyana, who had accompanied a British naturalist, Waterton, in an expedition to the Amazon. And to the amazement of Darwin's fellow students, Darwin spent long time with John learning the art of taxidermy, which would stand him in very good stead later in life. Now, some of the influences on Darwin during his early university years were firstly Erasmus Darwin, who was his paternal grandfather. Erasmus was an amazing man, a polymath, a mathematician, an inventor, a philanthropist, and one of the founding members of the famous Lunar Society of Birmingham, which played a major role in developing the first industrial revolution. And Erasmus Darwin wrote a strange book, Zoonomia, The Laws of Organic Life, in verse. And one of his comments there was, from their first rudiment to the termination of their lives, all animals undergo perpetual transformations, and many of these acquired forms are transmitted to their posterity. Now, that was well ahead of its time, even ahead of Lamarck at the time. And transformation was, in fact, the word they used for evolution for the next 50 plus years. So those were some very interesting insights which Charles was aware of. Charles had also read the work of Thomas Malthus, who showed that, while human populations expand at a very rapid rate, the resources on which they depend become available at a much lower rate, so that there will always be a struggle for existence. And what Darwin did was really extend Malthus's hypothesis from the city into the jungle. Robert Darwin, his father, commented at the time of Charles, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." And that admonition stayed with Darwin throughout his life, and he was determined to prove his father wrong. Darwin never completed his medical degree, and his father withdrew him from Edinburgh and sent him to Cambridge to study theology and join the clergy. And this experiment was more successful because Darwin reckoned that the life of a country parson would leave plenty of time for him to pursue his natural history interests. So he made a bit more of an effort, and in fact passed his theology degree with quite good marks. He also had the good fortune to meet some scientists who would support him through the rest of his career. One of them was the Reverend Professor John Henslow, who is Professor of Botany, who encouraged Darwin in his natural history studies, introduced him to natural theology, and would in fact be the person to whom Darwin sent all his specimens from the voyage of the Beagle to be distributed to experts. And typically of the day, Henslow was an ordained minister, but also an accomplished botanist and mineralogist. Another one was Adam Sedgwick, and it's from him that Darwin learned the principles of geological mapping and structural geology, and went on his only scientific expedition before the Beagle trip with Sedgwick when they surveyed the geology of Wales. At that time, Darwin read widely, especially the works of Alexander von Humboldt, but especially and also the Arctic explorers. And he developed a wanderlust and began to wonder whether the church was really the career he wanted to follow. But he returned to Shrewsbury and looked forward to doing some flirting with his girlfriend, Fanny Owen, when a stroke of luck arrived. And that is a letter from Captain Robert Fitzroy, who had been appointed the skipper of HMS Beagle to do a survey, a hydrographic survey around the world, and also to calibrate chronometers along the southern trade routes. Fitzroy was an interesting character, a distinguished naval officer, very authoritarian. He was a phrenologist who believed that you could tell a person's character by the bumps on the head and the shape of their nose. And his first look of Darwin, he was unimpressed. He felt that his snout suggested that he might be lazy and lack determination, but he was wrong. Fitzroy had an explosive temper, and his nickname among the crew was Hot Coffee. And he was a deeply religious man in the conventional way. Fitzroy asked the Admiralty to find a suitable gentleman companion for the voyage, someone who could share scientific tastes and make good use of the expedition's opportunity, dine with him, and so on. And one of the reasons for this was that it was well known in the British Navy that loneliness at sea can cause depression. And in fact, Fitzroy's own uncle, a sea captain, had committed suicide at sea because of depression and loneliness. Now, one couldn't think of two more different characters at the opposite poles of Victorian thought. Fitzroy was a conservative Tory who condoned slavery, felt it benefited people on both sides, and his priority was to maintain his privileged status quo and not encourage change. Darwin, on the other hand, was a progressive Whig who abhorred slavery, respected human rights, and favored change. But despite these differences, they actually got on quite well during the voyage. And here we see HMS Beagle, a 10-gun brig sloop with a remarkably large crew of 74 people, all crammed into a fairly small sailing ship. And it's interesting that almost all the other crew, other than Darwin, were semi-literate or even illiterate young men, some of them of school-going age, who were crewing the ship. There are cut-throughs of the ship, and arrowed top left is the captain's cabin, which Darwin shared with Fitzroy. It's important to note that the only major voyage that had taken place before this, which had had a naturalist on board, was James Cook's first Challenger voyage in the 1770s with the botanist Sir Joseph Banks on board. So this was a very important voyage from the point of view of a scientific participation. He has the route of the Beagle, leaving Plymouth in December 1831, stopping briefly off various islands off the northwest coast of Africa, and then making various ports of call along the east coast of South America and also out to the Falklands, up the west coast of South America to the Galapagos, and then across the Pacific and Indian Oceans to the Cape of Good Hope and back to England. Now, very significantly, Fitzroy gave Darwin a copy of the first volume of Sir Charles Lyell's revolutionary book, Principles of Geology, in which Lyell had put forward the theory of uniformitarianism, and that is that the forces that have shaped the physical shape of the crust of the Earth have always remained the same. So the forces that are active today are the same forces that were active before. And of course, this is completely in contradiction to the biblical version, where basically great floods, such as Noah's floods, were caused by God to punish humans for various misdemeanors. And Lyell also made the intriguing comment in his book that if the physical environment is changing, then surely plants and animals also need to change if they are to remain adapted. Now, we need to remember that at the beginning of the Beagle voyage, Darwin was far more of a geologist than a biologist. In fact, his biological knowledge was restricted to his hobbies, and he wasn't widely read in the field. But in geology, he was quite knowledgeable. And when one looks at the diaries of his geological explorations off various islands in South America, one is impressed by the depth of his knowledge. And during the voyage of the Beagle, he actually collected more information in support of Lyell's theory than Lyell had collected himself. And Lyell became a great supporter of him. And it can also be argued that Darwin's knowledge of geology separated him and differentiated him from the other early evolutionists such as Cuvier and Lamarck, etc., who were strictly paleontologists. And Darwin also had in his quiver other knowledge which those evolutionists didn't have. For instance, a very good knowledge of living plants and animals, and later of the process of artificial selection. One of the first places they visited were the Canary Islands, where Darwin saw the impact of a recent volcanic eruption, but they couldn't land there because of cholera. They then went to the Cape Verde Islands, and there again he saw the impact of geological processes on the structure, the crust of the Earth. Their first landfall in Brazil was in Bahia, and here Darwin was horrified to see Captain Fitzroy carried into town on a sedan chair borne by 4 half-naked slaves. This to him was the absolute pits. In South America, Darwin made extensive visits inland while Fitzroy was surveying offshore, and he made a number of important observations, especially about the variation intra and interspecific of living animals, and the similarities between fossil animals that they discovered and living forms. He observed, for instance, variation within the rhea, and Glyptodon was one of the fossils he excavated. This is a giant armadillo, which is quite similar to the living armadillos, which are much, much smaller. He also, in South America, witnessed geological processes such as flooding, erosion, sedimentation, and the impacts of volcanic action, which continued to support Lyell's theory. They visited the southern end of South America in Terra del Fuego, where he commented on the people there, how great the difference between savage and civilized man is, greater than between a wild and a domesticated animal. And remember, this is a comment from someone who is progressive for his time. Darwin made many geological observations. Islands were an important part of his study program. He witnessed the impact of various events. He actually firsthand experienced a major earthquake in Chile, and later observed uplift marine fossils high up in the Andes. He witnessed the impact of a tsunami, and he realized the importance of island biogeography in dividing up species. So by the time they reached the Galapagos Islands, Darwin was convinced of several things. Firstly, that the Earth must be much older than it is, that there are changing habitats, that species must therefore be changed, and that all change ultimately is geological in origin. But what, of course, the missing piece in the puzzle was what is a mechanism for that change? Now, there's a myth that Darwin, through his observations on the finches and iguanas and giant tortoises of the Galapagos, immediately came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection. But this is not true at all. In fact, it was only after Darwin returned to England and the specimens of finches had been examined by an ornithologist, Gould, that they even realized that the different Galapagos Islands had different species and that there was considerable variation within species. So although Darwin collected valuable information there, he still hadn't figured out this mechanism. And he then, from the Galapagos, sailed across the Pacific and across the Indian Ocean, toying with various ideas and trying to digest just what all the data he had collected had told him about. So he investigated the giant tortoises of the Galapagos. And a strange thing about Victorian explorers, and Darwin wasn't the only one, is that they not only described and illustrated the animals that they discovered, they also ate them. So Darwin in his diaries records tasting various insects and lizards and snakes and tortoises, and he actually tasted the flesh of the giant Galapagos tortoises. And he commented that they actually tasted different on different islands. So they set forth westwards across the Pacific Ocean, called in various islands, and all the time he was making copious notes. And when he returned to England, in fact, he spent the first few years writing up the geology before he wrote up the zoology. He wrote papers on the way in which atolls are formed, which was a different mechanism to the one that Lyell had suggested, and the impact of volcanoes and island biogeography. So he really was quite an accomplished geologist by the time he got back to Europe. He spent a total of 122 days on islands, I'm not counting Australia and New Zealand as islands, during the trip, and he investigated volcanic islands in 3 different oceans and non-volcanic in 2. He investigated atolls and defined different reef types and overturned Lyell's theories on atolls. Eventually, on the 31st of May, more than 4.5 years into the trip, Darwin arrived in the Cape Colony when the HMS Beagle dropped anchor in Simon's Bay off Simonstown. They weren't able to anchor in Table Bay because Table Bay was unprotected at the time from the northwester storms that were very common at in the 1830s. So they dropped anchor there. Darwin would then have taken a rowing boat to Fishhook, and then from there hired a Cape cart and gone into Cape Town. It's interesting that he spent more days in the Cape than at any other location except in South America, 19 days. He was aware that the natural history had already been well documented and did not record much about his Cape visit at the time. So one has to read his correspondence with various scientists in order to gather just how important it was. But he did meet 3 famous scientists and toured the Overberg, but he was also homesick, but nevertheless made a last effort to make good use of his only landfall in Africa. The first thing he did was examine the coastal fynbos and the rock formations around the Cape Peninsula. And the first scientist he visited was Sir Thomas Maclear, who was the Astronomer Royal at the Cape. And the importance of this visit, during which he was accompanied by Fitzroy was able to calibrate the 28 chronometers that they were carrying on Beagle. He also met Sir Andrew Smith, who was an army medical officer who had obtained his medical degree at Edinburgh University. He'd been posted to the Cape Colony and become the leading zoologist there, and was the first curator of the newly formed South African Museum, which was established in 1825. And Smith had just returned from a major expedition which had taken him as far north as the Limpopo River, and he was able to tell Darwin about the vast herds of game they had encountered and the different plant and animals that he had collected. Smith described as new species, many animals that are very familiar to us now. the largest living fish, the whale shark, he described based on a specimen that washed up in Table Bay, the crowned eagle, the rock python, girdled lizard, and many other animals. He also showed Darwin and invited him to study the collections in the South African Museum, including fossils of extinct giant buffalo. But of course, the quagga was still alive at that time, would only go extinct some 42 years later, so quagga was still to be found in the Karoo. Darwin didn't ever see the great herds of springbuck and wildebeest because they had at that time been wiped out in the Cape Flats area, but he was told about them by Andrew Smith. He did made some collections of insects and mites and so on, and described a few species, but he decided not to make any major collections of large animals because that had already been done. Andrew Smith also showed an important geological site, which is called the Sea Point Contact, although it's in fact in Bantry Bay. This had not been discovered by Darwin. It had been discovered some 18 years earlier by Clark Abel, but it was another proof of Lyell's theory of uniformitarianism and the fact that there are three different kinds of rock, sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic. And it illustrated that granite originated from magma deep in the earth, intruding onto sedimentary rock and forming metamorphic rock. Darwin also went on a trip into the interior. In some accounts, it's stated that this trip took 4 days, but I've worked with Roger Stewart, who's very familiar with the travels of early explorers in South Africa, and we've concluded that it would be impossible to have done this trip on horseback in 4 days. We reckon it took 5 days. Anyway, Darwin wrote in his diary, "I hired a couple of horses and a young Hottentot groom to accompany me as a guide. He spoke English very well and was most tidily dressed. He wore a long coat, beaver hat, and white gloves." So the two of them set off more or less along the route of the N1 from Cape Town to Paarl, and there they examined the large granite boulders. They then rode up the Franschhoek Valley, and there's the Franschhoek Valley as it might have looked at that time. And there they encountered slaves who had recently been released, but some of them were still apprenticed to their masters. And it's interesting that Darwin records in his diary that the French and the Dutch settlers were unhappy with the role that the missionaries had played in the abolition of slavery because it deprived them of cheap labor. And they also met the indigenous Khoi people. And it's interesting that Darwin's very first publication, co-authored with Fitzroy and written on the Beagle during their return voyage, was about the role that missionaries played in the abolition of slavery. They then traveled through the Theobatus Kloof Valley, but unfortunately didn't go far enough inland to see the spectacular succulent Karoo. They went through the old Hohoek Pass and stayed in the Hohoek Inn, which is South Africa's oldest hotel, established in 1779 and still operational today. They then went down what was then called the Sularikal Pass and across the Strandveld of the Cape Flats back to Cape Town. Darwin's ecological observations in the Cape included noting the very high diversity of plants. He didn't see much big game, but was told about it by Smith. He noted that African mammals are larger than those in South America, even though the plant life is much less exuberant, and that grass supports large African mammals in the absence of lush vegetation. He also was told that the large game had been decimated by civilization, but his response to that was rather off-putting, actually. He said, well, sadly, that is a consequence of modern civilization. Conservation imperatives weren't very high on the agenda at that time. But the most important person that Darwin met in the Cape Colony was John Herschel. And we need to keep in mind that during the whole 4.5 years of his voyage, Darwin had not had a single opportunity to discuss in depth his his burgeoning ideas and the data he'd collected with a knowledgeable English-speaking scientist. And with John Herschel, he really had a great mind to express his ideas to and have discussions with, because Herschel was highly regarded as a natural philosopher as well as an astronomer, and was also a very accomplished botanist. Herschel had come to the Cape in 1834 for 4 years to observe the passage of Halley's Comet, but also to map the southern skies. And there's some idea of the enormous amount of work he did. He was also a pioneer of photography and astrophotography, and in fact coined the term in 1839. Herschel lived in a beautiful house called Veldhuizen in Claremont with his wife Margaret, who was very active in the social scene. And Herschel had a large garden of indigenous Cape plants, mainly bulbs, which he was very proud to show to Darwin. And they met at least twice. Unfortunately, Veldhuizen doesn't exist anymore, but at least the Herschel Girls' School, named after it, is in the same architectural style. Now, John Herschel had recently published a book on the scientific method, but he also had some important things to say in letters. For instance, this one to Charles Lyell: the origins of fresh species would be found to be unnatural in contradistinction to a miraculous process, though we perceive no indications of any process actually in progress. It's the mystery of mysteries. And this was one of the topics of discussion that Darwin had with Herschel. And there's on the left, you can see the cover of the book on the scientific method that John Herschel had recently published. Now, their discussions on the mystery of mysteries didn't go into very much depth as far as one can establish from what Darwin wrote and from the letters exchanged between Herschel and Lyell and Henslow and Darwin. In fact, they disagreed on one point, and that is, if species have changed, and they both agreed on that, Herschel's view was that this change no longer occurred. It had stopped long ago, and species had remained tame since then. And of course, Darwin could not agree with that. And in fact, it was a huge disappointment to Darwin many years later when he sent a copy of The Origin of Species to John Herschel, who'd returned to England, that Herschel called his theory the theory of higgledy-piggledy. He just could not break away from the convention of creation and assign the incredible diversity of plants and animals to a random chance process. So in a rather derogatory way, he called Herschel's theory the theory of higgledy-piggledy and never quite supported it in its entirety. But I think the main point of Darwin's meetings with Herschel has been missed by many writers. I think the main benefit that Darwin got out of it was Herschel's advice on how to carry out scientific research on the hypothetico-deductive approach. He commented, for instance, that the best results come when the mind leaps forward by forming at once a bold hypothesis. And he advised Darwin, don't just be a descriptive naturalist. Use the vast amount of data you've collected to propose and test a big idea with your data. And that is a very profound thought that Darwin took with him back to London. And although he couldn't immediately implement the idea, it's something that I believe shaped the rest of his career. And that to me is the single most important thing that happened during his visit to South Africa. This advice from Herschel on how to make best use of your data by testing a big idea, and don't just be a descriptive naturalist. So they departed from the Cape of Good Hope on the 19th of June, 1836, back via to England. And Darwin initially, as still a bachelor, stayed in London. He was quickly elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of London and also of the Geological Society. He won the Wollaston Medal, and he was celebrated as a hero because he had been sending his specimens back, and they had been distributed by Henslow to experts to identify, and everyone was quite astounded by the value of his collections. But he soon tired of the sort of life of a hero and someone with a heavy social agenda. He longed for tranquility and became broody and decided he needed to get married. And in fact, in one of his diaries, he even has a little sort of quiz that he puts to himself, the advantages and disadvantages of marriage. But he decided that he would get married, and he married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, the great-granddaughter of the potter Josiah Wedgwood. And this was a marriage, one could say, made in heaven. She was enormously supportive of him, even though she was deeply religious, and they lived together until his death in 1882. In 1842, they bought Down House in Kent. Darwin commented at the time he didn't like the look of the house at all, but what he liked were the large gardens, because he knew that he would be continuing his research through experimentation with plants and animals, and he needed a large wild garden to do that in. Emma, very supportive and caring, a devoted wife. They had 10 children. Sadly, 2 died in infancy, and another died at the age of 10 years, which greatly dented Darwin's belief in religion and also in the medical profession. There you can see top left Anne, who died at the age of 10, and that was deeply distressing to Darwin, and on the right with his eldest son, William. Now, Darwin's work environment is very interesting because he came from the sort of moneyed gentry. He never really had to work for a salary. He never worked in a university, a museum, or a research institute. He never had a formal laboratory. He sent specimens to experts, corresponded voluminously. He would have been a great fan of email. He loved attending agricultural shows because he soon realized that artificial selection, which animal husbandry men and horticulturalists practice in order to improve the strains of their plants and animals, he realized that this is just a fast-track version of natural selection. But he also carried out his own artificial selection experiments, culturing orchids, breeding pigeons. But most importantly, out in the Kent countryside, he had time to think without the bureaucratic load of managing a research career. Here's artist's impression of Darwin's study. We did a lot of his thinking and writing. And you might notice on the bottom right-hand corner, I've circled something because a recent history on the history of office furniture gives Darwin credit for the first person to invent a wheeled office chair. Now, what was he like? He was shy and sickly. In Chile, he'd been bitten by a bug called the Chagos bug, and it's almost certain the cause of his rather sickly demeanor for the rest of his life. He hated publicity, but he was a patient and observant researcher, highly focused and practical, curious, with a childlike curiosity, and innovative, an excellent family man, prolific correspondent, and very ethical. And here he is with the small group of friends, Joseph Hooker, the botanist, Lyell, the geologist, and 1 or 2 others. And he was the only person that he initially confided his ideas on evolution to before he eventually published The Origin. Now, Darwin's science was old-fashioned observation, collection, and classification, but as a result of the influence of Herschel, with a clear hypothesis in mind to propose and test. He was patient and unhurried. He didn't think that anyone was on the same track as him. And he also followed Herschel's advice that you must collect vast amounts of data to test your idea so that when you eventually publish it, you are secure in the knowledge that it is defensible. He was driven by raw imagination and curiosity, not chasing research grants, and he was non-elitist and unaffected by current dogma and intellectual baggage, as would be the case if you were employed by some institution. His motto was, "Let the data speak." And because he lived in this unaffected environment, he was open-minded and open to novel conclusions. Darwin did a remarkable number of household experiments. For instance, he put skylights in his roof and studied and measured plant movement towards the light, phototropism. Of course, he boiled down skeletons. He was fascinated by pollination, and he studied the pollination mechanisms within orchid flowers. And one of those orchids had a trigger mechanism that when the bee settled in the flower, this trigger flicked pollen onto the bee. And because they didn't have plastic at the time, when he made a model of this orchid flower, he cut a bit of whalebone off his wife's corset in order to make the trigger mechanism. He worked with his gardeners and his wife and his children on these experiments. They would, for instance, flick a flower using feather dusters onto bumblebees to follow the bees and determine their home range. He'd put bottles of earthworms on the piano when Emma was playing to see what reaction they had to vibrations. And he used clothes pegs to measure the strengths of bean roots as they rooted themselves in the soil. And as you see on the left there, using a donkey-powered lawnmower, he would cut his lawn at different intervals and then count the number of insects in the different lengths of grass. There on the right is a map of the Downhouse Gardens, where he did a lot of these experiments, and you might notice at the lower end of the diagram is a cricket field, and I had the pleasure of actually playing a cricket match there in 1976 for the London House team. And on the left, you can see Darwin in his hothouse with his orchids. He also had a thinking walk. A very important part of his daily routine was to go down the thinking walk. And on the right is his famous doodle with "I think" at the top, which was one of the first examples of a phylogenetic cladogram. As I said, Darwin indulged very enthusiastically in pigeon breeding and attended agricultural shows and was a judge at them. He also took notice of dog breeders and how they were able to breed for certain strains. He also embarked on a very ambitious research program on barnacles from 1846 onwards, both fossil and living barnacles to basically investigate intra and interspecific variation within barnacles. Now, it's well known that he wrote a number of essays on his developing idea on evolution in 1842, 1845, into the 1850s. And there were a number of reasons why he delayed publication. Firstly, several scientists who had proposed theories about that time, but without sufficient supporting documentation, had been severely criticized. He was afraid of persecution by the Church of England. He was acutely sensitive to his wife's religious beliefs. He also was a very cautious scientist and a non-confrontational personality. But then in mid-1859 came the bombshell. Alfred Russel Wallace, a young British naturalist and collector with whom Darwin had corresponded and who was collecting specimens in the Malay archipelago at the time, wrote a letter to Darwin in which he described almost, but not exactly, Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin was horrified by this because he thought that his life's work would suddenly be lost and the credit would go to someone else. But he was saved by his friends, and they arranged for Wallace's letter and Darwin's latest essay, which was quite comprehensive, I think 253 pages, to be presented at the same event. And of course, Darwin, being the non-confrontational person he was, who also didn't like publicity, was not at that early presentation of his theory. Anyway, in December 1859, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was published. and it remains in publication and is one of the most successful science books of all time. By 1872, it had already been through a number of editions, and it continues to be published today. And as I said, when Darwin sent a copy to Herschel, he came back with a comment that it's a theory of higgledy-piggledy. But by then, Darwin wasn't too concerned about Herschel's opinion because he'd received support from so many different scientists in different disciplines for his ideas. But there were some opponents. One of them was Sir Richard Owen, who was probably the leading British paleontologist at the time, taken over from Cuvier in that field. And he established the Natural History Museum in London and also coined the word dinosaur. And he strongly opposed Darwin's theory, not on a very strong basis, basically by saying creationism is the explanation for the mechanism of evolution, but he mainly questioned Darwin's method. Anyway, there was a great evolution debate in June 1860, some 7 months after the book had been published. On the one side was Soapy Sam, Samuel Wilberforce, the bishop, and on the other side was Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley. And this furious debate took place at the Oxford University Museum, but Huxley easily out-debated Soapy Sam. But it was quite a hectic event. Apparently, Lady Shrewsbury at the time fainted in the middle of the debate, and the wife of the bishop, as they were leaving the hall, was said to say, "I hope it's not true, and if it is true, I hope it does not become broadly known." Darwin, of course, didn't escape the cartoonists and caricaturists at the time, because this was the height of cartooning, but he had a sense of humor, and he in fact apparently quite enjoyed it. So this talk is not about his theory, it's about the man, but in a few words, what is evolution by natural selection? It's heritable change in living organisms over many generations to adapt to a changing environment. And it requires Earth and ecosystems to change. So this is where the geological origin of all change comes in, that space and food are limited, as Malthus proposed, that there's therefore a constant struggle for survival. Species must change to adapt. And the important thing is that at every generation, random novelties are produced. And the best adapted of those novelties are most likely, over a long period of time, to survive, breed, and pass on their genes, which results in permanent, irreversible changes. So what did Darwin achieve? Firstly, he provided a mechanism for evolution, which was an absolutely revolutionary discovery. He upended the biblical version of creation, explained the origins of biodiversity, which remains highly relevant today, laid the foundation for genetics and, of course, neo-Darwinism. And from the point of view of a science educator, I think also very importantly, changed the public perception of science, especially of biology and geology. And Theodosius Dobzhansky commented, "Nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution." It explained the so-called struggle for survival. It's never been refuted. It has phenomenal explanatory and predictive value and has improved public understanding of science. Darwin died of a heart attack in April 1882. He had never been knighted due to objections from the Church of England, which later apologized for their treatment of the great scientist. He nevertheless was granted a full state funeral, which was attended by thousands of people, both opponents and supporters. His pallbearers included his close friends, Huxley, Wallace, Lubbock, and others. And he was buried in Scientist's Corner in Westminster Abbey, near Sir Isaac Newton, next to Sir John Herschel, and more recently, Stephen Hawking has been laid to rest at his side. Now, looking back, who are the greatest scientific communicators? I rate Dmitri Mendeleev and his periodic table of elements in the physical sciences, chemistry, and Charles Darwin in the biological sciences as two of the greatest science communicators of all time. Of course, since Darwin, there's been an enormous development of his ideas, and he, I think, would be delighted by the way in which those ideas have laid the foundation for so many new subdisciplines of science. In 2009, we had celebrations in South Africa, and I attended them in the Ezekiel Museum. And during the question time, I asked the question of the panel, which included FRSSAf, what would surprise Darwin if he came back into the world today? And the comments were, firstly, the vast extent of the fossil record. Secondly, the advances in genetics and genetic engineering. Thirdly, he would be surprised that so few new species of animals had been domesticated. In Africa, it's only the guinea fowl, and just a sprinkling of species have been domesticated since his time. He would be pleasantly surprised by the number of active neo-Darwinists, but also disappointed by the rise of creationism, human impact on the environment, and that science and religion have not been reconciled. Now, something that struck me in my research on Darwin is that virtually everywhere that the Beagle made landfall, landmarks, landforms, cities, towns, national parks have been named after him. Mount Darwin in Chile, Darwin Arch in the Galapagos. There's even a mountain in Zimbabwe named after him, even though he didn't go there. In Australia, they, of course, have named a city after him, and in that city is the Charles Darwin University, and nearby the Charles Darwin National Park. Yet, his important visit to Cape Town is hardly commemorated in any way. There was a Darwin Trail developed in 2009, but that has unfortunately gone defunct. There is a very important but small and rarely visited display in the Ezekiel Museum, but I think we've got to go further than that. So I've mounted a campaign to have a bronze statue of the 27-year-old Charles Darwin mounted on the Simonstown jetty near to where the Beagle dropped anchor in Simonstown. And here is the clay maquette of the bust made by the sculptor John Stein, illustrated here. And I believe it's a remarkable resemblance of the young Darwin. And interestingly, it's even done in the sculptural style of the 1830s with, of course, the appropriate haircut and sideburns and clothing. So this is the clay maquette that we are raising funds to have cast in bronze. We have permission to mount the bust near Jubilee Square in Simonstown, near the statue of Just Nuisance, and near the Navy diver statue on Simonstown Jetty. The celebrations of the unveiling of the bust will coincide with a visit of the Dutch sailing ship Oosterschelde, which is the flagship of a campaign called Darwin 200, which is celebrating the 200th anniversary of Darwin's accomplishments. They recently left the Galapagos Islands and will be in Cape Town from the 6th to the 28th of April. And top left, you can see the library of Oosterschelde when she last visited Cape Town in 2013. The events that we'll be organizing at the time of the Oosterschelde visit include the unveiling of the bust, a play, an art exhibition, a series of talks, and a debate. Well, the play will be by the famous South African actors and producers Liz and Nicholas Ellenborgen, who will play Emma and Charles Darwin, and that we hope to perform in Simonstown and Cape Town, and hopefully perhaps in the Origin Centre at Wits. It would be great to travel the play as well. Dirk Danez has agreed to mount an exhibition on the theme of evolution and Darwinism at his Art at Africa gallery on the V&A waterfront in Cape Town. And we're delighted to say that Dr. Sarah Darwin, the great-great-granddaughter of Charles Darwin, will be in Cape Town at the time of the visit to the Oosterschelde, and we hope that she will be the main host at some of these events that we're organizing. And here she is with the framed copy of Darwin's famous I think diagram. So that's the story of Darwin I have to share with you. I sincerely hope that the Royal Society will take part in these activities, and maybe it will host the debate about Darwin and Darwinism, which we hope will be held in the Two Oceans Aquarium in Cape Town. Thank you very much.
Come on. Thank you very much, Professor Bruton, for an absolutely amazing talk. I read quite a lot about Darwin. My parents were a bit disgusted that one of the first books I bought when I started buying proper books was The Voyage of the Beagle. And I've read some other stuff about that, but that was really amazing the way you pitched together all the different bits in such an entertaining talk. Thank you very, very much. Are there any questions? There's only two things in the chat. And if I'm not careful, this is going to mess up. No, there's no called. I can't see any questions for the talk in the chat. So I'd just like to ask, oh yes, there's a hand up. Emlyn Costa, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I can't echo more strongly that this was a truly phenomenal distillation of so much related information about such an important topic at such a significant time. And I'm taken particularly, Mike, by your last slides because they resonate with the problem facing today's world, which is, as various onlookers have said, a degree of estrangement between humanity and the natural world. And so my question, which I'd love to talk with you about in more depth, and maybe with a view to us doing something together, is the focus on Darwin's life. And one might also say Alexander von Humboldt, whose work has been summarized as nature would exist without humanity, but humanity can't exist without nature. That these minds and others that you would put into this class, who were distilling so much, synthesizing so much significant new insights into the natural workings of the planet and its life, are sorely wanted in this age of ignorance by society about the nature that we so depend on. And so what I'm curious about, and please talk about this at other lengths, other times, but there is, I'm sure, with your knowledge and insights about Darwin and his friends and colleagues, there is yet another layer that you might want to draw out of your phenomenal knowledge about him and his friends that would sort of really focus, if I can put it this way, on what is missing in today's scientific establishment that is the power of the way in which these gentlemen thought and acted. I mean, you said a lot of this in the end, and maybe it's all there, but yeah. But to put it in the context of what's missing in terms of the scientific mindset today, where you can't really find, I don't think, with some exceptions, a modern day Darwin.
Yeah. Emily, thank you. I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah, we'd like to see the Darwin bust and the activities that go around it and the oyster shell visit as the beginning of a long-term debate, not only within the scientific community, but with decision makers and with the general public on not only evolution and Darwinism, but on biodiversity, the importance of biodiversity, and especially the fact, as you said in the Humboldt quote, that we are utterly dependent on nature's processes for our survival. And the Anthropocene epoch has shown that, we are not managing the planet well. In fact, we are, potentially causing our own extinction through what Adam Wells has recently called not just climate change, but irreversible climate breakdown. And we also want to mount a campaign around the Darwin events that refutes the pseudoscience and anti-science sentiments that are become so widespread through the megaphone of social media. Because, of course, the theory of evolution is one of the main targets of the pseudoscientists. And we want to use this as an opportunity to combat those thoughts and open debate on them in the community. And we're very keen to involve qualified scientists and thinking adults, but also young children, young people in these debates. So yes, we need to move from beyond the body of science of knowledge into using that knowledge to implement realistic actions that make it possible for us to create an environment in which we and all the other inhabitants of the planet can not just survive, but thrive.
So could I supplement just briefly that with the recent decision by the International Union of Geological Sciences, Mike, as you know, I think, that the Anthropocene is most effectively defined as the entirety of the cumulative intensifying disruption by Homo sapiens on the natural world. And so it's not just something that goes back to the mid-20th century when we did atomic bomb testing, as had been the proposal by the Anthropocene Working Group, which has been rejected, but rather as a long accelerating change. And so I think that, just building on my earlier question or comment, is that the thinking about the Anthropocene as being defined as the humanity's disruption of the Earth system, of the Earth human ecosystem, as I'm called it in my latest paper with colleagues from Cambridge and London, is really something that could be very effectively married with this incredible insight into what made Darwin tick. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about. Yeah,
I think we need to give a few other people a chance to ask questions. But yeah, we must focus on actions now, using scientific knowledge to convert it into actions, because our survival depends on it.
Thank you. There's one comment from William Bond. He says, thanks for the talk as well. Brilliant tour de force. But he said the takeaway message of Herschel, is that from Herschel or Darwin? Because it's deeply resonant.
Well, yeah, I think what Herschel gave Darwin was a compass that he could design the rest of his career around, instead of just being descriptive zoologist, rattling off incremental papers. He could focus on one of the biggest ideas in the history of science and rally all his data and the data of the hundreds of scientists who visited him at Down House to come up with and test this idea. And of course, it's never proven, it's always being tested. If someone comes up with a better explanation for the origin of biodiversity, then that needs to be duly considered. But so far, all the evidence is in favor of Darwin's theory. But I'd appreciate, William, if he's online, if you have any further comments, and I'm hoping that you will be one of the members of the debating panel that the Royal Society organizes at the aquarium.
Can't see him. I think it was just such a marvelous thing, because a lot of the people in that time, they were, as you said, doing descriptive stuff, and it was incremental. So to take that bold leap, even though he was almost petrified to, promulgate it wider, I just think that was, he did it, but he until he sort of had to get out there, I can't help wondering how long he would have sat on it. I mean, okay, he was refining it and looking at other things and coming up with other examples, but yeah, it's quite interesting.
That Huxley and Lubbock and co from the middle 40s onwards were urging Darwin, publish, someone's going to preempt you. You've got enough data. And Darwin's very conservative nature, held him back. But I think it's important to realize that the ingredients to Darwin's success were firstly the huge opportunity of the voyage of the Beagle, which few naturalists at that time had an opportunity. Secondly, his solid grounding in geology was very important. Thirdly, unlike other paleontologists and evolutionists, he had a good knowledge of living plants and animals and their variation of living forms. And then, of course, his knowledge of artificial selection, which he rightly concluded was just an accelerated version of natural selection, allowed one to study evolutionary processes within a human life cycle. And, it's a combination of all those things that allowed him to come up with a holistic idea that was defensible and which no one else had come up with.
And then there was Wallace hard on his heels. But the other thing I find amazing about Darwin is that he wasn't living in our age where there's much more freedom to think about things and express yourself. And I know in some countries, people can't do that, but every country I've lived in, you could do that. And you could, if you wanted to say something, you just had to try and stand up for it and try and say why you thought that was right. But in his time, that was so totally different. And even the great debate, with the best paleontologists of that time against him because it wasn't biblical. I just find that absolutely mind-blowing that he could actually do that. Okay, he was a bit reticent, but he still did all the thinking and the writing. And to me, that is just mind-blowing.
Yeah, what I found impressive about Darwin is, once he had put his thoughts together and accumulated this vast amount of supportive information, he was far less afraid of the criticisms of scientists because he felt that he had the data to defend his theory. He was far more worried about the criticisms by the church and how this would affect his wife and his family's reputation and so on, because that was still very strong at the time. But after that debate in June 1860, the church didn't really, interfere in a major way. Science came to the fore, and to a large extent, science and religion learned to live together.
They could do better. States.
I must say, in terms of, the tolerance of various countries, I've had the interesting experience of living in a number of Middle East countries, and especially in Saudi Arabia, where certain aspects of science are just not accepted. Human evolution, for instance, radiocarbon dating, continental drift, even the validity of the fossil record. And, it's distressing that various Eurobarometer and Pew surveys have shown that a number of so-called advanced countries in Europe and North America, more than 50% of people don't believe in Darwinian evolution. They believe that humans coexisted with the dinosaurs and in creationism. So science has still got a fight on its hand, and we must use, the ammunition of Darwin's inspiration to fight that fight. Oh.
Exactly. I mean, when I first came to South Africa, I really wanted to go and look at, go to the place where Mrs. Pletz was found. So I duly went off, and the person who showed me around didn't believe in evolution. And I'd gone off on a Sunday. And then the next day I was back at Wits University, and I was sitting in the common room, and I was just still blown away. And one of my colleagues came in, and they thought something horrible had happened to me because I was sitting there with my head in my hands, still trying to get round this. And when I told him what had happened, he just explained how things were taught and all this when he was coming through. So, yeah.
Yes, my copy of Mrs. Pless's skull, kindly given to me by Francis, and I use it frequently in my talks. Yeah, I gave a talk to a conservation organization in Omanus a year or so ago, and there was a creationist in the audience who in question time stood up and thumped the pulpit, and and he gave me a copy of his book, which I read subsequently, which is complete rubbish. unsubstantiated decision-making and all that. But yeah, he told us he'd spent his whole career refuting Darwinism. And yeah, I gave a talk in Hout Bay recently on Darwin, and there was a member of the audience there who also, indicate he totally does not accept it. So, it's not universal.
Yeah, I know. Thanks. Are there any other comments?
Francis, don't you have a comment?
Yeah.
Unmute
I was
yourself,
exactly going to
please.
say that because I saw him and he's still here.
Yes.
Okay. I greatly
Francis.
enjoyed the talk, Mike. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. One point that I would like to make is that there's that wonderful drawing of Charles Darwin as a young boy, 7 years old, and he's holding a pot with a plant in it. And it's a South African plant called Lachenalia.
Right. Amazing. And Lachenalia is a genus of a group of plants in which Marjorie Courtney Latimer collected a new species, which is called Lachenalia latimeri. Francis, do you have any comments on my feelings about the importance of Darwin's discussions with Herschel? Okay, he's gone.
He's still
Back to
there, but
you.
he's still muted.
Back to you, Leslie.
Yeah, I was just going to say the connections go on and on and on, with the plant, and it's the South African plant. I mean, isn't that amazing? It just really, really is. And yeah, but I think that the more we can push what's going to happen next year with you, that will certainly help and reach out to more people. I think that is going to be great.
Well, we don't need to wait for next year because the Darwin 200 project through the flagship Oosterschelde has already mounted a massive social media campaign to promote interest in Darwinism and evolution of biodiversity. So, there are all sorts of things that one can participate in right now. If you just Google either Darwin 200 or Oosterschelde. And they also have a ever-changing group of young researchers on board the sailing ship who are doing research projects in the field and also desktop and laboratory work. So it's a very, very active program. And the project manager of the Darwin 200 project, with whom I'm in contact, is very excited about the kind of things they're going to do with us in Cape Town. And in fact, will be visiting me in about 2 months' time to fine-tune the various activities so that, we can get as much done as possible during their 3-week visit.
Brilliant.
And, hopefully we can, through live streaming, we can share what we do with Royal Society members and guests and others throughout the country and elsewhere in Africa.
Well, that's wonderful. We have it didn't run this year for various reasons, but we're trying to get it back off the ground for next year. The Royal Society of South Africa has had a school essay competition, and we've been throwing around a few topics, and I think this should be a brilliant topic, and put it back into biodiversity, climate change, and all those things.
Yes.
So yeah,
when I was on the council, I contributed a number of essay topics, and maybe one could be so bold as to say that the 5 essay topics should all be alternative topics, on the subject of Darwinism, evolution, biodiversity, the impact of Darwinism. There's such a wider range of topics. We could easily find 5 that are not overlapping within the broad theme.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to publicize the winning entries at the time.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Sounded like somebody was coming in.
This is Peter Vale, and I'm talking from Port Elizabeth. Thank you very much. A very interesting talk. As this work proceeds, and particularly next year, I think you've got to have an international or an imperial historian to talk about the really ease of Darwin's journey. There was no need for passports. There was no need for, it wasn't a product of an imperial position. Now, this can back into the difficult questions of, is this white knowledge and the whole decolonization thing? But I think it would be a pity to miss the opportunity of talking about how easy the empire was able to spread knowledge and to gather knowledge at that time. It seems to me a wonderful example, this of that particular thing. So thanks, Mike. I just thought I would contribute that.
Right. Thank you, Peter. Great to hear you again. Yeah, that's a good idea. In addition to Sarah Darwin, we're hoping that some notaries from England will come out to Cape Town when Oosterschelde is here. And it'd be great if the Royal Society could, host some talks by them. And if they don't come out, that maybe we can have some online talks from the Northern Hemisphere.
Can I maybe suggest that Saul DeBow is a Cape Town boy? Is at Cambridge, and he works in this field. He might be a good person to do that. And Mike,
I missed his name, sorry.
Saul DeBow.
Okay.
And Mike, you missed Darwin College, Cambridge, which was established in the 1960s. You'll remember in your monuments to Darwin.
Yeah, I didn't mention all of them by any means. There's a wonderful sculpture in the garden at Oxford University. But yeah, there are statues and monuments all along the east and west coast of South America. Yeah, but we haven't got anything meaningful. I mean, the eco display is very important. And there's a brief mention of Darwin in the forever being molested signage at the Sea Point Contact, but otherwise there's really nothing. There is a dog down the road, a beagle called Darwin, but other than that, I haven't found anything else.
Thanks. I don't think that counts. Oh, because it won't last that very long. Emlyn Kostler, your hand is up again.
Yeah, well, just a comment of a very different nature. This is to do with the 200th celebration and the premises for it, premises plural. I'm reminded of the 400th anniversary celebration in New York and the Netherlands of the voyage across the Atlantic to discover the so-called New World, and thinking that the Hudson River might lead across the top of North America into the more oriental part of the world. But what started off being a rather simplistic notion of a celebration involving maps and tulips and cheese and the early maps of Lower New York, which became New Amsterdam, the idea was born early that in addition to those things, and this is why it has bearing on the 200th anniversary of Darwin, I think, is that what Henry Hudson discovered as he sailed into New York Bay, as it would then become called, was he saw Lenape indigenous people fishing oysters out of the estuary, and the Hudson was a pristine estuary, abundant in life. And so the accent of the 400th celebration became what was called the H2O Forum, a play on words that would actually compare and contrast the Hudson River estuary that he discovered 400 years ago in 1609 with the current, intensely built up, very polluted current Hudson estuary. And so it became a multidisciplinary affair involving the private sector, government, and university research. And I think that it became clearly the more the merrier. And I'm suggesting as a parallel that there is a very wide story to be told beyond just the science of Darwin's phenomenal explorations and discoveries. And again, I'd be pleased to talk about that. I was the co-chair of that board.
I really hope that does happen, but we've got to get the first step behind us. And I'm loath to sort of commercialize the Royal Society, but we have got an appeal out for people to donate to the Darwin Memorial Fund, so we can cover the cost of casting the clay maquette into a bronze statue and mounting it on a granite plinth in Simonstown. So anyone who is interested in contributing to that fund, please email me at mikefishersbruton@gmail.com, mikefishersbruton@gmail.com, and I'll send you information about the appeal. The Geological Society of South Africa has kindly provided a ring-fenced bank account into which donations can be made, and they give me regular updates. We've so far raised 70,800 Rand of the 135,000 Rand that we need to not only mount the bust, but also launch these various activities such as the play, the art exhibition, the debates and the talks. So anyone who is inclined to support it, even in a modest way, we'd greatly appreciate that.
Great, thank you very much. Don't see any more questions. I just wanted to announce, thanks again for a lovely talk. And there's going to be lots of following up on this. I just wanted to now announce a couple of things, well, 4 things really, that should have been in my opening slideshow, but I was too scared to do that in case we couldn't get back to Mike's presentation. And these are just new members to welcome to the Royal Society of South Africa. And that's Dr. Douglas C. van Niekerk, Dr. Alaric Prins, Professor Admore Shonai, and Dr. Christine Steiniger. That's actually a reinstatement. So welcome to those. And we've lost Mike in person, but I think he's just popped off to one side. I think we're rounding up on this. There's a lot of things that's going to be happening. As Mike said, they're starting today. Well, already started this year. And there's a lot to be happening in South Africa. So I think it's going to be a case of watch this space. And I'd just like once more to thank Mike again for an absolutely fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right.
And thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Leslie, for hosting it.